How do we convert between polar and rectangular coordinates? Well, it comes down to the idea that an x, and y coordinate is described by a horizontal and then a vertical change, whereas an r, theta coordinate describes a distance and a direction. So what we can see is that there's this right triangle that we can set up between a polar coordinate and a rectangular coordinate. So if we want to convert from polar to rectangular, we want to figure out how do we find x and y if we have r and theta. So x, how is x related to r and theta? Well, this is the adjacent side of a right triangle. So the adjacent side over the hypotenuse, that means that this is r cosine theta. And for y, it's the opposite side, and we're comparing it to the hypotenuse. So this is r sine theta. So these are the equations that we will use when we're converting from polar to rectangular, because we can plug in r and theta, get out x and y. If we're going the other direction and we're trying to find r and theta given x and y, well, how do we find r? Well, r is related to x and y by the Pythagorean theorem. So r squared equals x squared plus y squared by the Pythagorean theorem. And theta, well, what we know is that theta can be described by y over x if we talk about tangent of theta. So tangent of theta equals x divided by y. I'm sorry, y divided by x. So here are the equations that we use when we're trying to convert into polar coordinates. So first, let's figure out what the rectangular coordinates are for these. So once again, what we said was we're always going to be doing r cosine and r sine. So so we have what's cosine of 300 degrees and what's sine of 300 degrees. Cosine of 300 degrees is 1/2. Sine of 300 degrees is negative square root of 3 over 2. So negative 2 square root of 3. For number 2, we have that this is 2 cosine 5 pi over 3, 2 sine 5 pi over 3. What's cosine of 5 pi over 3? Well, that is a negative 1/2. And this is positive square root of 3 over 2. So that leaves us with that. 2 comma 0. Well, we're doing 2 cosine of 0. Sorry, that's supposed to be a 0. And 2 sine of 0. Cosine of 0 is 1. Sine of 0 is 0. So in fact, these representations are the same. We're going right to and not changing anything either in terms of a rotation or in terms of a translation up. Number 4, we have 1 comma pi over 2. So that's going to be 1 cosine pi over 2, comma 1 sine pi over 2. And cosine of pi over 2 is 0, sine pi over 2 is 1. So that's how we convert from polar coordinates to rectangular coordinates. If we want to convert rectangular coordinates to polar coordinates, notice that there's a restriction given that r is going to be greater than 0 and theta is going to be between 0 and 2 pi. It's not always the restriction, but that's typically what the restriction will be. We can say r squared equals those two things squared added together. So r squared equals 8 plus 8. So r squared equals 16. R equals 4. And tangent of theta equals negative 2 squared roots of 2 over negative 2 squared roots of 2. That's y over x. So it equals 1. So theta is going to be 45 degrees plus 180n. Now we can look at the quadrant of negative 2 squared roots of 2 comma negative 2 squared roots of 2 to determine that n is going to have to be 1. So theta is not 45 degrees, but rather 225 degrees. So that's our first answer is 4 comma 225 degrees. I think I'm going to need more space for number 7 and number 8. Okay. Now here, r squared equals negative 2 squared plus 2 root 3 squared. Please make sure to put these in parentheses before squaring them. We don't want this to turn into a negative 4. This is 12. So r once again is 4. And then tangent is 2 root 3 over negative 2. So negative root 3. So theta is going to be 120 degrees plus 180n. And based on the quadrant, this is going to be 120 degrees, so 4 comma 120. We should probably write these in terms of pi, since it's written as that. 4 comma pi over 2 pi over 3. And this is 4 comma 5 pi over 4. The other two questions that I want to do are 4 comma 0 and negative 2 squared roots of 3 comma negative 2. Here, r squared equals 4 squared plus 0 squared. So r squared equals 4 squared. So r equals 4. It's not always 4, but in this case it is. Tangent is 0 over 4. So tangent is 0. So theta is 0 plus 180. And based on the location of that point, since it's on the x-axis, which will be the polar axis once we convert to polar form, we have 4 comma 0 is also the representation in polar coordinates, maybe 0 degrees or 0 radians. Here, r squared equals negative 2 root 3 all squared plus negative 2 squared. So that's 12 plus 4. Goodness, I picked a bunch of problems where they all had the radius 4. And then tangent equals negative 2 over negative 2 root 3 equals 1 over root 3. So if tangent is 1 over root 3, then that means that theta is, let's write this in terms of pi over 6 plus pi n. And that means, based on the quadrant, that it is plus pi. So that's 7 pi over 6. And therefore our coordinate is 4 comma 7 pi over 6. Thanks.